Now, so that's that part. And then when it comes to the Biden, the administration overall, as well as Biden himself, his response to this, I've actually been kind of impressed with it. I don't think they've had the worst kind of reaction to all this news. And the administration is getting slammed pretty hard in the media right now. They are kind of being blamed for like handing the country over to the Taliban. But Biden and his people seem to be kind of holding out against that. Like Biden himself, I think, is actually on vacation right now. He's not even supposed to be back at the White House until next week. But not long before Kabul actually fell, he put out this statement pretty forcefully defending his decision to withdraw troops. Like one part of it, he had said, quote, 1 more year or 5 more years of U.S. military presence would not have made a difference if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country. And an endless American presence in the middle of another country's civil conflict was not acceptable to me. And, I thought that was pretty good. That's about like as good of a thing as I can hope for him to say against this. People blaming him for basically giving the country over to the Taliban. And then also you had the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. He was doing sort of the media rounds today. He went on like 3 or 4 different mainstream shows to talk about the fall of Kabul. And pretty much all throughout that, his argument has been that we cannot stay in Afghanistan forever. And that's sort of like, we have to leave at some point. And this was basically inevitable. And so I thought also he was kind of taking sort of the right approach. There's some things that you could criticize, but like, for example, Jake Tapper of CNN was basically saying that, like, why shouldn't Biden be blamed for this supposedly hasty withdrawal? And I just think it's such a ridiculous question. Like, we could have slowed down this withdrawal for another year or 2 years, make it August 2022, 2023, and this would still happen once we leave. Like, the Taliban is still going to roll in and take things over. Nothing that we do is going to change that. And the people in media just don't seem to really understand that, like, beyond permanent occupation, there is no other outcome here. 20 years of arming and training and $2 trillion spent here, like, if that can't do it, then, staying another couple months is not going to make the difference. Now, I think people like Jake Tapper do make a good point when they say that this withdrawal was very poorly planned, as we've kind of been saying. That, like, it is kind of weird that they would pull out this tiny force of like 2,000 or 3,000 guys that Trump left there, only then to send in another 5,000 or 6,000 for this evacuation. Like, clearly that is a sign that this was not thought out very well. If they're pulling out guys only to resend them back in. And then there's another thing, too, that the administration has kind of been arguing that I think very much falls apart. Blinken has kind of been trying to, like, portray this as a victory, as this whole thing. He was, like, trying to insist that, like, there is no comparison to the fall of Saigon and Vietnam because that, we achieved our goal of getting the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. And, forget the fact that al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden had fled Afghanistan in the first few weeks of fighting there. And then it took us a decade to actually find him like 100 miles away in the country next door. And then we stick around for another 10 years fighting the Taliban and doing all this nation building stuff. Like, clearly that was a massive failure. So Blinken's attempt to try to sell this as any kind of success, I think, is absurd and totally falls apart. However, I do think that the administration is sort of taking the right approach when they're saying that, like, a lot of the stuff was inevitable and that staying a couple months, a couple years longer could not have, prevented what we're seeing now in terms of the Taliban, taking over.
Right. Now, well, I guess there is maybe something to the fact that, let's say if Biden decided to put like 100,000 troops in the Afghanistan, it probably wouldn't have fallen on August 15th. Right, like
Right.
that would have made a difference. Now there may be some U.S. Young men and women coming home in boxes because of that decision, but at the same time there was probably something Biden could do to slow the Taliban advance. But at the end of the day, as you're pointing out, that this wasn't ultimately going to change the fate of the war at all, and the Taliban probably were going to go on an offensive after the past year and a half of having signed the deal with Trump and expecting the U.S. to leave, and so it's not like the Taliban wouldn't have been taking territory anyway. So I think that's a fantastic point. I think definitely some praise has to go to the Biden administration. It is the most one of the more difficult political decisions to make in Washington. Now this does have apparently support of the 70% of the American people who want to end this war. However, it ending in the way it did and sticking with it through this is something that you gotta give Biden credit for. I don't know, Trump couldn't follow through with it in Syria, so it is something that you kind of got to say that Biden must be committed to this policy because it is going to be weaponized against him heavily. And I guess he's willing to accept that, and that this is going to be something that rightfully is kind of a black eye on his record, but far more there are a lot of people in Washington who are more responsible for the situation in Afghanistan than Joe Biden, who I mean, while he isn't like necessarily anti-Afghan war, I mean, even under the Biden administration, he didn't want to surge, but it's not like he didn't want to wage a drone war and special forces raids in the country. He just wanted to turn the Afghan war into the Somali war, which in a way is better. I would rather just bomb a country, once or twice a month than, 6,000 times a year and have 30,000 troops deployed to that country. But, that you're asking me, if I'd rather be shot in the head or the heart, it's not really a good option either way. So, there's a lot of problem with the arguments that the Hawks are making. One thing that the Biden administration has been putting out, Will, that I thought was really unfair, is that they're placing a lot of blame on the Afghans for this. Now, look, something happened in Afghanistan that's going to be reported in the coming weeks, that where we really understand how the hell the government lost this much territory this fast. They say we trained 300,000 Afghan troops. I could guarantee you, Will, that there wasn't 300,000 Afghan troops a couple weeks ago. The roles of troops were far shorter, and I'm sure, like in Iraq, the number of troops who were not only on the rolls and showed up for their jobs, but were also willing to fight for parts of Afghanistan that weren't their homeland areas, the Uzbeks fighting now the Uzbek parts of Afghanistan. That probably wasn't going to happen, and so the numbers shrink that way more. But when you look at just how poorly the U.S. has executed its nation building effort, just look at the reports from the U.S. Inspector General for the Afghan War, John Sopko. Time and time again, he says that the Afghan state can't stand without the U.S. Now, I don't think he predicted that it was going to fall before the U.S. even finished their withdrawal. I'm not sure anybody really thought that it would be done by this point, but at the same time, there definitely were a lot of people who were aware that the U.S. built the Afghan nation very poorly, and it's definitely not fair to place all the blame there when a lot of it falls on the 4 U.S. administrations that have attempted to carry out this war for the U.S.